required. I'm Melina Tsapos, and this is In-Depth Conversations. So I'm very pleased to welcome back Professor Erik J. Olsson to In-Depth Conversations. If you haven't seen our previous episode with Erik, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's called Feminine Culture in Academia, and it's our most viewed episode to date. But our discussion today will be about something a bit different than that. We will talk about activism and science, because on the one hand, there's researchers that believe or wish to describe the world objectively, and they believe that that's where the academics' duties end. But on the other hand, there are those who think that it's part of academics' responsibility to change the world for the better, by, for example, informing political policy or doing activisms of various forms. So this topic is actually hotly debated today, both here in Sweden, but also worldwide, amongst academics who, for example, are keen to understand their role and responsibilities in doing research, but also lay people who they place their trust in science. So it's an important question for them as well, especially for us who are our universities who are tax funded. Recently, Erik has been interviewed for an article in Göteborgs-Posten about activism within the universities. The article writes that the issue of activism divides researchers, as I've just described. But more than that, Erik, you've been concerned with this question as it relates to academic freedom and the foundation that you are a chair of and a founding member, Academics' Rights Watch. So you're also doing research now, as I understand it, within your research here at the university that relates to these questions. So maybe we can just start off by welcoming you to the program again, to the channel.
Thank you very much, Melina. Yeah. Great to be here. So yes, I also do some research now on academic freedom and relatedly on activism, although I haven't focused on the activist side. But of course, I mean, one issue regarding academic freedom is how much freedom do we actually have as researchers? Yeah. Can we go out and try to change the world directly and engage in various social actions and so on? Or should we restrict ourselves to what I believe to be the main purpose of science, namely to describe, explain and predict various aspects of the world? So that's so my research here is actually quite related to the activist issue. Yeah. And so my basic view on this is that the basic function of science is rather to, well, perhaps change the world, but do so indirectly, namely through your studying a certain topic, or it might be COVID, or it might be climate change, or what have you. And what we do then in science is that we try to explain the phenomena as well as we can, and we try to explain, to describe them, explain them, and predict what will happen given certain interventions. If you lower the CO2 or do this and that, and then the basic idea is that this information then can be used by the general public or by governments or various actors in actually changing the world directly. So in a sense, the mission of science is to perhaps change the world, but do so indirectly through the research and not directly through political action. So that's my basic view of this. And why is this so? Well, and you touched upon this just now here. And science, in my view, in order to be tax funded, has to be seen as a public resource. So another way of putting it is that everyone should be able to use scientific results. So it should be something which isn't tied to a particular political view or ideological thinking, and that kind of thing. So it should be something which all people could actually draw upon in their activities. Yeah, so that's why I think it's problematic if you take activism too far, and we can discuss what that means.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. But so what you're saying is that there is this difference, a distinction that you make between activism and maybe traditionally how academia or universities have done research, and what the goal has been to provide some, if I understand you right, some kind of objective research that then however society chooses to use it will be up to society or the politics, or but that's beyond the scope of academia. Is that
there's a certain limit to how much academia itself can become activistically engaged. So, and it's very interesting to think about where that limit is, and it's of course not entirely uncontroversial because people have different views about this, but I think that for instance for a university to become an activist university is a very bad idea. So it's you have universities, perhaps we shouldn't mention names here, but who try to become kind of progressive, and social justice universities. Perhaps not so much in Sweden as in other countries. And of course the thought there is very the intention is a very good one, but here we have to be very careful not to risk the reputation of the university as a general resource which everyone can draw upon. And of course, people have very different views of what is actually the right thing to do.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
We will have this conflict very clearly.
So I wanted to ask you about that, just to pinpoint down. Why do you think? What do you think is really the difference? Like, why do people? First of all, as the article writes, it's a divisive matter in academia. It seems like, and do you agree with that? That it's dividing researchers?
You mean the activist issue itself, or?
Yeah, whether it is the academic's role or responsibility to be activist and to change the world, or should we try to be more objective? What do you think is the conflict there? Why don't they agree with each other, these two sides? And obviously, I think you're more on the non-objective.
I think it's rather complex actually, because there are different kinds of activism. So you have one kind of activism which starts actually with good standard research. So you have people who actually have done their homework scientifically, but then they go out in the world and they make claims that don't actually follow from their research, but they make claims of a more kind of broader normative issues and so on. So it's I think that's one kind of activism. So a case would be that you have a climate scientist who perhaps has done research on the CO2 and its connection to global warming, and then goes out and says that now we should reduce CO2. I mean, it doesn't follow from that research alone that you should do anything in particular. So why is that? Well, the reason is that there are so many things that we want to do in the world, and many of them are conflicting. So you might promote one end, reducing CO2, but then in the process you might be in a worse position to do other things that you find worthwhile. For instance, it might reducing, or having very radical measures for reducing CO2 might lead to poverty, starvation and things like that. So the reduced economic input or output. So that's one issue there. And then of course you have the more even worse kind of activism, where you actually have the science itself being corrupted by various practical interests. So that's another kind of activism. So I think it's a rather difficult picture, and there are a lot of aspects to take into account.
Yes, very interesting. On the one hand, the example that you mentioned, it's actually a contemporary issue or question going on right now. As you very well know, climate activists, since it's election year here in Sweden, do talk about these issues and have publicly stated that it should be a political issue, climate change. So we can get back to that and use specific examples maybe, even if they're Swedish oriented, but it's still interesting.
I think that these kind of examples is something you find everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. But on the other hand, I was thinking about you mentioned that this has further consequences in society if the academic states the policies or wish to actively change the world, and then you talk about these consequences that it has. So maybe you want to expand a bit on that, like what could the dangers be if researchers step beyond their roles?
I think that one danger is that I mean that some of these issues are of course divisive in society, so people will have very different views on these, and then people might think, why should I mean, as a, let's say that I have a different view on climate change or a different view on COVID, or why should I fund research which promotes a certain perspective on that, on those very difficult issues. So you have that kind of taxpayers problem. But I think more seriously, I think that it would be good for science to stick to its basic enterprise, its basic mission of describing, explaining, and predicting, because that's where science does its, most obviously useful job. You know? So what happens is that you jeopardize the integrity of science if you step out of that role. And you do it, carelessly. So that I think is the main danger there. And of course, if you look at the even more severe problem of activism, in the sense of you're having research to actually allow political consideration to enter into their own research. So that's even more dangerous. But I think more dangerous basically for the same reasons, that you jeopardize the integrity of science, and people start thinking that they might not be willing to fund the research or so.
What would you then answer to critics that might say that science has actually never been objective? It can't be, because first of all, it presumes that we can stay objective, but as humans we know that we're incredibly motivated by all kinds of things, values that we have, and therefore it will always be reflected in our research. So there's no such thing. What they argue, I guess, is that there's no such thing as objective research. So it's better to be open about it and be admitting it, because otherwise we'd just be hiding it, rather than we don't get rid of it, we're just hiding it, and perhaps not being aware about something that's, do you understand what I mean? This is the kind of criticism.
So one reply to that is that I concede that all the normal psychological and sociological forces that act on people act also on people in science.
Yes.
So science is part of society in that sense. So there's a lot of biases, and people have various practical interests and so on and so forth. But having said that, I think there's a huge difference between someone who actually honestly tries to rid him or herself of those limitations, and tries to do as best as he or she can do in terms of honestly searching for the truth on the one hand, and someone who doesn't do that but gives it all up completely. In my view, if you don't even aim at objectivity, you must question your position at university. So why should you be at university if you don't aim at least on truth or objectivity? So I think that's. I think it's a false dilemma to say that we are either objective or not. I think that the important thing is whether we aim for objectivity with all the limitations and the psychological, biases that we have, or if we don't do that.
But it sounds to me like, and I'm inclined to think the same, that there is one right way that the universities should be, for example, striving towards objectivity and provide a general source of information to society. But the other hand is trying to do social justice, or promote things that would improve the world. Why is one more right than the other? Because as I see it, the other side could also argue that, why does it have to be this way? Maybe it's just a matter of having conservative values or radical ideas. So,
No, but so if you look at what science has already accomplished, look at all the things, all the medicines, all the bridges that we can build, all the fantastic innovations that we have, all the things that have actually benefited our lives enormously, and which is partly the reason why we're sitting here comfortably, not searching for food or doing anything all the time. So, look at all that, and who can doubt that science has already had a tremendous social influence on our lives. It hasn't always been for the good, but if you look at the whole range of things that science has accomplished, surely it has been a huge benefit for society already. And why is that? Well, it's because we have conducted scientific research in this manner I described, namely objectively. We can find out, how should we build a bridge? How should we construct a vaccine which is actually effective, and so on. And all that presupposes this traditional view of science. Mm-hmm. So the problem if you step out of that role and try to do something else, you actually jeopardize the social function which science already has. So you risk not having all the benefits that science has provided in the past and also in the future. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you can have both. You have to. Well, you can have some of the activism as well, but you can't have it all. You can't have an activist university, for instance, which is completely or entirely or mainly devoted to social justice or what have you, because that would jeopardize all the other benefits of having a university. And here we should also mention, critical thinking. So we hope that our students go out in the world and they think critically and they write articles in the newspapers, and they engage in society in various ways. So students are also part of this enormous utility which science has. So that's part of the product that we produce. So all that would be jeopardized if we started thinking that we should be doing something else. Mm-hmm. Because then people might think, well, can I trust the scientific results now? Because perhaps they depend on a certain perspective which I don't share myself, and so on and so forth. So you get all these problems. So I think the problem here is that you get home blind in a sense. One forgets all the benefits that universities already have, also in the social sense of bettering people's lives. Yeah. And you take that for granted, but it shouldn't be taken for granted. Yeah. It should be something which we are really careful about.
Indeed, I think that's a very important point you're making, to remind ourselves of that role that university has had traditionally, and maybe perhaps that is part of its success as well, that it's had for hundreds of years. But I would like to go back to this thing you talked about in the beginning, where you mentioned influencing indirectly or directly, this distinction that you made. And I was thinking a bit about how universities are funded and projects, how they are funded. And would you say that perhaps society in that way has already decided by where they're allocating the fundings to which projects? If we talk about a concrete example, the COVID that everybody's just been through, and we know a lot of things happened, policies came in place, there was a lot of action taken, and a lot of it was based on research. Right, and how research was suggesting that we should do things, but we also know that there were still other issues in the world. There wasn't only COVID, but because of funding, it was an enormous funding just towards the COVID question, because that seemed urgent for society to solve. So wouldn't you say that during other situations as well, that, for example, climate change, if we fund climate change research, it's a way of policy informing the other way around, that policy informs science rather than science is trying to inform policy.
Yeah, so here you have you run the risk of having policies from outside influencing actually the research that's been done. That might not be so bad if the research is still being conducted in an objective way. Okay. So, because there is something to it, to saying that society should have a say in what themes that we address in science. But of course, there's also the danger here that these policies will actually corrupt science, and because often the expectation is that the results should be of a certain kind. Yes. Let's say that you're a climate scientist and you come up with CO2 not having a substantial role in global warming. It wouldn't be a welcome result in many camps, because the whole idea of financing a certain kind of research might be that the expectation is a certain political,
So is it the lobbyists, the fundings that won't welcome it, or are you saying it's the institution itself or the department itself?
I think it's both, actually. I think it's also, the problem is also when you write an application in certain areas, especially those areas which are, kind of politically loaded, it certainly would benefit your application if you dramatize the point a little, Yes, So if you tone down the whole idea of global warming, surely it would be, beneficial for your application. So it would be beneficial to quote the most alarmist, person you can find, basically. And then everything is somehow getting out of hand, you know, eventually. So I think that's where the scientists themselves have a certain activist tendency, which is actually a system error in a sense. It's because of a system failure, namely that you have to convince someone for what research you should be doing.
Yeah.
But it also comes from the other side, you know, from governments, and because they usually, when they found something, they have an idea of what kind of result they want to have. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the same is true in research in gender studies, for instance. I mean, if you found gender studies, I mean, if the government does that in Sweden, they usually have an idea that should somehow benefit the governmental view of equality, and the oppression of females and so on and so forth.
So that's why I'm curious a bit how you were thinking there about because there was these two sides, right, where it's the scientist, him or herself, that is the activist, or the policy asking for activists, basically, right? Because if they fund research and researchers that are openly suggesting policies or change, because that's what they want, then how is that dynamic?
Yeah, I think you can easily get symbiosis between the government or whatever policymaker you have and certain groups of scientists, because what the policymaker wants to hear is that the scientist is repeating, I mean, their own policy, basically. So then you get, and of course some scientists, they take up this, opportunity then, and perhaps unconsciously or perhaps consciously, I don't know, but you see that, I mean, in climate science, for instance, you see that so there was a recent example in Swedish media where a well-known professor of climate science went out and stated what goals should be, or what the issues should be the main issues in the next election for the government. I mean, that's completely out of his, in this case, area of competence. And but of course,
why is that? If you want to be just explicit, why?
I mean, he wanted to have climate change being the one of the main issues, and the other one being preventing war. But of course, these are two of many different things that people care about. And so why should the climate science scientist have anything to say about what should be the priorities of society? So there you step out of that. But of course, from a governmental side, given the government that we have, it's fantastic because they can point to the scientists and say, well, this is what science says, you know, these are the things that we should focus on in our election.
Yes.
And all the rest of you who don't do that, you're unscientific. But of course, that's not the case. I mean, but the impression is there, you know.
I think an important thing maybe to bring in here that you've often mentioned is committing the naturalistic fallacy in this case.
Yes.
Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, I think it's very, very good for us doing research to go back to the central thought that a description of something cannot imply how things ought to be. So if you describe something, you say how something is, which is the basic function of science, in my view. It doesn't follow anything substantial or anything at all, actually, about what ought to be the case. So it's summarized as is doesn't imply ought, you know. Yes. And not adhering to this insight is committing the naturalistic fallacy. So you believe then that a pure description of something actually implies how things ought to be. And this, I think, is very much applicable to science and activism, because a typical kind of activism is someone who goes from something being the case to how something ought to be.
Like the example you gave about the politics should be concerned with climate change, for example, or the war question. But wouldn't the obvious follow-up be that there is this condition implied? So the implication would be that if we want to avoid a climate catastrophe, then we should be concerned. The election year's most concerned question should be with climate change.
Yes, but that's very interesting, because it's a conditional statement. Yes. So it's a statement of the kind that if you want to pursue this goal, and it's the most important goal, or perhaps the only goal, then you should do this and that, you know, or lower CO2 or whatever you have. Yes. But that's still within the scientific realm, because it's actually a means to end the reasoning. You know, So you're saying that the most efficient way of achieving a certain societal goal is to do this and that, which we have studied in science then, and so it's all perfectly clear. But the problem with that is that it doesn't follow from that we should actually lower CO2 because there are a lot of other goals and the things that we want to do in society, and some of these are conflicting, and so it's not that you can't, as it were, just stipulate then that you should carry out the means to that end, because there might be other ends and there might be conflicting ends, and the situation is usually very complex. I mean, this is the case in climate science, where people are well aware nowadays that radical measures of reducing global warming will have a serious effect on other areas, and poverty and the food supply and all that. But also in the COVID case, you have the same complex picture. So basically nothing follows from epidemiology regarding how to react to COVID in society, because of course you want to prevent disease in society, but you also want to have your liberties, your civil liberties, your freedom of movement. You want to be able to speak without having something covering you and making it more difficult, covering your face and so on. So there are all these other things that you also want to have, and here again you have to find a compromise then between all these things. And in my view, this is a political issue; it's not a scientific issue. So of course, science can inform politicians then about various things, about the efficiency of face masks for this and that and so on. But from science itself, no policy follows. It's as simple as that. And this is, in my view, the grave error committed, perhaps understandably, by Greta Thunberg.
We can't mention
iconic
yes.
young woman. So she believes that you should only you only need to listen to science, and then somehow the policy for climate change will come out, and shine through. But that's not the case. Nothing follows from science regarding what to do regarding the climate.
But if we're being a bit charitable, and let's see what you think about this, but if we're being charitable to Greta, don't you think it's implicit in what she's saying that obviously we don't want to have a climate catastrophe? If we want to live life as we know it today, we should listen to science, which says that these things will happen if we don't change something. Don't you think that's how we should understand her, or what's the mistake there?
I think that without going too far into an area where I don't have an expertise, in climate science. I think that if you say, I think it's problematic to say for science to say something about the outcome of climate change in normative terms. So a catastrophe here, that's a term which actually hides the normative character of the conclusion, because catastrophe means that it's bad for someone and perhaps for many people, but that's compatible with it being good for other people. So presumably, and this is just a common sense speculation, and climate change as it's happening now, and most of us believe that it's happening, will have some bad consequences for some, but it will have good consequences for others. And then you have the problem of weighing that together somehow, or somehow aggregating all the goodness and badness somehow in a political decision of what to do. So what is happening here is that a political decision about how to react to climate change is hidden or masqueraded as a purely scientific issue. So I think it's very important when thinking about this, that we are clear about what are the normative claims that are being made and what are the factual claims that are being made. So in my view, when you say that something is a catastrophe or has a catastrophic outcome, it's a hidden normative statement, which is, in my view, probably more on the political side of things rather than on the scientific side of things. Although science, of course, might inform you about when thinking about the consequences, but in the end, science can't tell you what's good or bad. Science just tells you what is. I mean, that's the basic function of science. And then, of course, I know that there are, practical philosophers who think otherwise, but I think that we should, I think we should at least try to maintain that picture of science, because it has worked so well in the past, and we should be doing something quite radically different.
Yeah. Okay. If you don't mind, then maybe we can go on to your own research and to your work and what you do. And as I mentioned in the introduction as well, Academics Rights Watch. As a passionate professor who cares about your profession, we do have our own interests, right? All of us, like you said as well, all researchers have our interests that comes with all our psychology and so on. Do you think that this value of academic freedom, is it not also a bit political in that sense, and therefore advocating for it, or talking about why we should want to keep these values its core interests for the universities? Isn't that also a type of activism that you're talking about or referring to here?
Yeah, but I think it's a kind of activism, because I want to change universities, primarily in Sweden, into the direction of having more academic freedom. And here we should remember that on many rankings, Sweden scores quite low on academic freedom, strangely enough. So, but it's also a very limited part of reality that I want to change. I mean, it's just the universities. It's not that I'm going outside the universities. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I see it more as trade union work, basically. So it's acceptable to be engaged in the conditions of your own profession, and even want to, further the conditions of your own profession. So, that's why we have trade unions who defend the profession, various professions. So, police has one trade union, academics have one trade union, and so on and so forth. But the problem with the academic trade unions is that they have problems defending certain principles, and in particular academic freedom principles. And there's a long story to why this is so. But the main point about that is that they are mainly concerned with security issues, to have a safe job, and the negotiating up your salary and so on. So they focus on those things. Yes. And in my view, they sometimes forget about the deeper things about protecting academic freedom and protecting the freedom of research and things like that. But they are, of course, without freedom of research, you can't do research. It's as simple as that. Yes. And without freedom of teaching, you can't really teach, because it becomes something else. It doesn't become teaching. So it's actually about protecting the constitutive rules for science, the things that make science what it is. So if you jeopardize those norms or rules, then you don't even want to call it science anymore, because people aren't free to teach or do research and so on. To summarize, I think of it as a very special kind of accepted activism in that sense. So I don't see it as a problem here. And another part of that is that I'm a philosopher, and the philosophers have traditionally been activistically oriented. So you have a lot. You can go back to Socrates and.
I wanted to mention this as a quote. Maybe perhaps you know it. Let me try to. Here we go. Yeah. Karl Marx famously wrote that the philosophers has thus far only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, he writes, is to change it. So, first of all, I take it that you don't agree with this, that it hasn't been traditionally to interpret the world, but.
There have been. Philosophers of different kinds, but I think that Socrates is probably in the more activist side.
Okay, yes.
Because he went out and he actively wanted to change people's minds on various issues, and so that's Can
I ask you about that though? Sorry, because I know this is being nitpicky, but did he want to challenge people to think differently, or did he actually want to change the world in his specific way? How do you understand it?
Well, I think it's mostly the first way, that he wanted to change people's minds, and so they didn't actually he didn't have a political ambition beyond that.
No,
that's true. But yeah, so you might question the idea that Socrates was an activist, but he certainly had these activist moments, you know. And,
but in his own defense, he was saying he was just asking questions.
Yes, right? Yes, that's true. Yes. But he didn't do any research in the traditional sense, or any. I mean, anyway. So his activity was very, I mean, public in terms of public engagement. So, yes, so in that sense, he was an activist. But if you go, I mean, further in the future, then you have Bertrand Russell, for instance, who was, I mean, most famous as an activist in the women's suffragette and the anti-nuclear movement and so on and so forth. But the thing there, I think, is that the philosophy has a rather special role in science. So I don't think that Russell, when he did these activist things, misled the general public about the nature of his expertise, for instance, as a climate scientist would if he or she went out and specified a certain policy for society to take, you know. So I think that the critical thing here is whether or not you in your activities mislead people to think that you have certain expertise that you in fact don't have. Mm-hmm. Because the things that Russell were engaged in weren't really, they were normative issues, you know, about women's rights and of course they had also descriptive sides then, this issue, but I don't think that he actually misled people in thinking that science had proved that women should have certain rights, for instance, or that we shouldn't have an atom bomb or things like that. So it's and I think that's very different. But there's a striking difference between philosophy on the one side and more empirical science on the other side. You know, where you can actually mislead people very, very, I mean, easily about the nature of your expertise. Having said that, the philosophers nowadays also do empirical work, and I'm one of them. So it's a complex picture. Mm-hmm. But that, I think, is the so my point here is that for a philosopher is less likely to mislead the general public in that sense than most other scientists.
Is that because, well, as you say, they don't engage typically with empirical research, but when we refer to empirical research, and to tie it back to our previous conversation about feminine culture, in Academics' Rights Watch, oftentimes you refer to biological, evolutionary research, right? That those are the causes for some things that you see are happening in society. Right. And when you do that, isn't that using research in your thinking in your claim?
Yeah, no, that's very, very interesting also. So the background here is that we have stuck our necks out quite considerably by thinking that many of the values that drive science traditionally, objectivity, truth, and so on, are most easily endorsed by males rather than females. So there is some truth to science being a patriarchal structure. I'm not saying here that women can't do science, and so it's much more subtle than that. It's just a statistical claim about who most naturally endorses scientific values, and so some of that those ideas go back to sociological research by Gert Hofstede and others, very famous sociologists. But the way I see this is that it gives you another picture than the usual picture of the sexes in science. So the usual picture is that women and men are equally good at everything, basically. So it's if there is a discrepancy between the number of women and the number of men in there, it's just because of social factors. So that's the kind of the mainstream view on that. So if, for instance, the reason why there are so many physics professors at the university is mainly that women haven't been allowed to engage in physics, but if they were to be allowed, they would do that equally well and so on.
Yes.
And similarly for nursing studies or medical studies. But my point here is that what we are doing with this research is to present another picture of things that is kind of like a hypothesis, another way of looking at the university from a gender perspective. which is a contrast to the standard way of viewing, I mean, the gender issue. And here I can connect to Russell again, because Russell actually was very, very aware of the role of philosophy of preventing alternative hypotheses or different ways of seeing things, which might not be all true, also, but they are presented as not as a dogma, but as a kind of a new vision of things or a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I placed, I mean, this kind of research or this kind of activities that we're engaged in here.
And maybe just to be clear, you don't suggest what society should do about these results that you're presenting or that you're hypothesizing about. Rather, you're just presenting them as
a different way of understanding the gender issue.
Yeah, but what would you then say? Because I think a lot of people do hear you and do read Academics Rights Watch, your website, for example, and draw conclusions that, or infer, actually, I should say, infer that you are suggesting that therefore perhaps we should limit female participation at universities and so on. What would you say?
It doesn't follow from what we are saying there. So what we say there is that we have this different perspective on things, and there might be natural reasons why women are drawn to certain subjects and men to other subjects. And what we have suggested is that we should end all the quota policies that we have. So that's okay. So you might call that an activist move, but so that's. But apart from that, we haven't really said much about that. And we also think that it would be good to have some kind of document at universities, like the Chicago Declaration or Chicago Statement, which specifies the norms for academic discourse. You know, that you shouldn't disinvite speakers because of their political views, you know, and all that. You shouldn't deplatform and things like that. So it should be great consensus on those things. So that's what we have proposed. But so I haven't explicitly stated that there should be a certain, balance between the sexes. But it's an interesting question whether that should be the case or not, or what would happen if you. But I think that would be something which gender studies should actually look into.
Okay, getting somewhere.
Because what is the optimal distribution of males and females given a particular activity? So that would be nice to study. That would be interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's scientific issue.
If we can go back just to this idea that you were talking about, that I found interesting about trade unions, for example, and that when you're making these things, like you're saying, you're staying within the university and within your profession. And that's what you're trying to change, not the whole world, in a sense. There's also, I would imagine, a critique that would say, well, all these things like having gender quota and, I don't know, maybe environmental push within academia or within the universities as policies, that they have also something to do with, for example, work environment, improving the work environment and making it comfortable for everyone to have equality and so on, and these policies that are implemented. Would you say that maybe that's what they're doing instead of being activists, or you can have certain ideas about what the university should do and how it should be organized, and so if you just promote those things as a scientist, then you're stepping actually beyond your own competence. Then if you're carrying out a normative agenda of how science should be, structured and so on. So it's but I think the thing here is that you have competing interests. Of course, some people like myself, we want to promote academic freedom, and other people want to have a safe environment. For perhaps safe from criticism or safe from being dismissed and things like that. So of course there are different ideas here, and what I've done here is that I've tried to look at international agreements on how these things should be somehow weighed together. And my favorite document in that regard is the UNESCO 1997 recommendation for the status of higher education teaching personnel, because there people have actually sat down and thought very carefully, in my view, about how these different things should be weighed together and combined, and
one statement in that document says that academic freedom should be scrupulously observed. So it has a kind of overarching importance, and the reason for that is because we want to have the quality that we associate with science. We can't have a lot of other things that compromise that quality, and the honest search for truth, that's fundamental to science. And so my idea here is that if people have already thought long and hard about how to combine various aspects of scientific policy for the university, so why not make use of their work? And here you actually have at UNESCO this wonderful document they have produced on precisely this. So it's a recommendation for the status of higher education teacher personnel, and it deals with all these issues about activism and academic freedom and so on and so forth, and also the work environment, which is another thing. Mm-hmm. So one idea that I have is to, and this is also basic for academic rights watch, is to make use of that document as a kind of international standard. Mm-hmm. So rather than inventing our own ideas about the academic freedom, we have made use of that document. But not only because it derives from UNESCO, but also because we actually like the principles, and they seem to correspond very closely to the traditional idea of a university. Mm.
So they incorporate also the aspects of having a good work environment?
Yes, for instance, they incorporate the idea of tenure, and the objective evaluation of research and researchers and so on and so forth, which are of course often violation of those things are often the cause of disturbances in the work environment. Someone is hired for the wrong reasons, things like that.
Some corruption. And you believe that a document like that could be applicable for all universities internationally?
Yes, that's the idea of this document. Is actually so it gives you an international standard for thinking about academic freedom, and to me it makes very good sense in the way it has been described, and it has been outlined. And again, we use it in academic rights as our main standard for academic freedom.
Yes.
So when we take up the different cases of what we believe are violations, then we always check whether some principle in this document was violated or not.
Yes.
So that gives our work in academic rights was a kind of objectivity, which it wouldn't have if we just freely invented the principles of academic freedom.
Yes, yeah. And of course, the subjectivity, as we mentioned in the beginning too, is also important for lay people to be able to refer and use science as a resource, right? Do you see how perhaps this could help prevent maybe polarization in society, or does it contribute to it?
Yeah, I think that a very good example of that is the German COVID situation. So I followed the situation in Germany because I used to live in Germany, so I watched German television a lot.
You even speak a bit of German.
I do. Yes, I do. And so there, what they did there, and this connects very, very nicely to the idea of a divisive agenda. Yes. What they did was that they delegated basically the decisions about COVID policy to a health authority called the Robert Koch Institute, because no politician wanted to touch this sensitive issue. It was too delicate, an error would have had catastrophic political consequences. They delegated to a medical facility, and of course what they did was to prevent disease. Basically. So they introduced face masks. They introduced severe lockdowns over several weeks. And people got really, really angry about that, because they didn't understand why. Why was it so important to prevent disease? In comparison to many other social goals that would interfere with that goal. Yeah. So this is an example to me where you have where actually a health facility actually became an activist government unit, probably without understanding that this was the case, So I want to contrast this to the Swedish situation, where we also delegated the COVID decisions to an authority, but it was a authority with a much broader perspective on things. so it wasn't just about medical health, it was about public health. And public health includes, mental health, it includes a lot of different things. And purely by luck, I mean, Sweden then ended up not having this very divisive policy regarding COVID, which really has been, very severe in Germany. So that's an example of the problems when you delegate, policy decisions to supposedly scientific units.
Yes.
And they only, make use of their own perspective and their own agenda.
Yeah, that's an interesting, because that's what we're trained to do, right? Like we're focusing in and narrowing in on our research, and of course that becomes the most central and most important.
Exactly.
We're not really trained to have this wide-eyed overview of what's actually going on in society. That's not part of our job or our job description in a sense as academics.
And this is, being very engaged in something is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it makes you very, careful about your research, and you become very, careful about the details and so on and so forth. But it can also make you very interested in a particular outcome or desired goal, or so it has these two different sides, So
since we are human after all, as well, right?
So it's one part of the human bias.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So,
okay, but I think we've touched on a lot of issues here, why it's important for all kinds, both as academics. Me as a new PhD, I'm also interested in where is my limit, because on the one hand I'm encouraged to speak in public forums and media and talk about my research, and of course I'm excited about it, but where does that responsibility or duty end and something else takes off? Where do I step beyond that? We've been discussing it in my ethics course, for example, and I've seen that we're not everyone is on the same page, even within academia here at Lund University. And we can also see the huge debate going on in the States, worldwide, and how maybe it is contributing to, if we don't really have or believe that we can have some kind of objectivity, perhaps that contributes to polarization in society, as you've just mentioned, a lot of effects that it had in Germany and in other places. But it's been really interesting and informative. Erik, thank you so much for letting us hear about your thoughts on this, and continuing further work.
Thank you, Melina.
Thank you.